the passage of this bill. Kia ora.
Reno Tirakatini.
Atihe wā muri ora ki te whai au ki te ao marama. E aku rauranga tira Ngāti Raukawa, tēnā koutou, hara mai, nau mai, piki mai ki te whare pāramata, ki te ana raiona I takatui nei. Hara mai ki te whakatutuki I ngā wawata o rātou mā. Nō koutou tēnei rā, nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. E rauranga tira mahuri no I te whare tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou katoa. Mr. Speaker, like an orator with a favourite pepeha, once again I stand and say to understand whakapapa is to understand Māori history. And whakapapa is the ties that link Māori by a common strand of DNA. And it's about how the history of the past is forever remembered by those of the present because of a shared history with a common ancestor. But whakapapa, genealogy and oral history, kōrero o ngā mata, isn't just about the ancestors of past times. It's also about the here and now. It's about what's happening in the present and be able to guess what the future holds. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome the whānau from Ngāti Raukawa who are here, and it's a great privilege for me to stand to tautoko this settlement bill at this first reading. Because it's in my time as a member on the Māori Affairs Select Committee that we have been able to listen and read the historical accounts of iwi Māori who have been able to settle their grievances with the Crown. And I also endorse the kōrero of our chair, mai whanaunga tau, that this history, the history contained in these bills, should be taught in every school, throughout the motu, throughout the country. Mr. Speaker, I know other speakers will talk about specifically about the various elements in redress that Ngāti Raukawa will receive in this bill, but for today, I'd like to take the time, as I do, to kōrero about those extraordinary times of the 1860s and the significance of those times relative to today. The 1860s brought significant upheaval in our young nation. Governor Gore Brown's hui for loyalist Māori at Kohimarama in 1860 proved that Pākehā governments had no real intention of investigating Māori hope and aspirations of the time. For in 1862, the return of George Grey, Hori Grey, from South Africa was about to set the scene once again. Fresh from oppressing natives and coloureds over in South Africa, he blew back into the country in the early 1860s to finish off what he started in Waitara 20 years earlier, and starting the first Taranaki Wars. But also, he managed to kick up some dust by crossing the Maunga Tāwhiri in July of 1863, thereby starting the Waikato Wars. And the kingitanga refusal to sell any more land ultimately forced the governor and the parliament to invade the Waikato. In the 1860s, the New Zealand Parliament was semi-autonomous and Grey still had some executive powers. It was at this time that Raukawa, as staunch supporters of the kingitanga, were drawn into the Waikato Kingitanga Confederacy because of that thing called whakapapa I spoke of earlier. Ngāti Raukawa, Ngāti Maniapoto, Waikato, Ngāti Haua, these great tribes of the Tainui had shared a common ancestry. But on a more contemporary level, there were many families of Ngāti Raukawa who had intermarried with the families of Waikato and the Tainui Confederation of Kāwhia, as well as Ngāti Maniapoto. It was this genealogy that made the kingitanga strong. It was their staunchness that put pressure on Auckland and the government. And Grey, master of the conquer and divide method of operation, brought in New Zealand's next biggest wave of immigrant, the soldier. Grey brought 18,000 into this country during his second term as Governor-General. And Raukawa suffered because of this whakapapa, but especially at Rangiao here, east of Te Awamutu, in February and a few months later in March, April at Ōrākau in the year 1864. Ōrākau is the place where innocent people were slaughtered as they fled from their trenches. It was during this battle that Rewi Maniapoto gave his famous retort to Gilbert Mayor's plea for the Māori to surrender. And Rewi's famous words are translated were, "Friend, I shall go on fighting you forever and ever." Rewi was a fighting chief of Ngāti Maniapoto and leader of one group of rebels that included many individuals and families of Ngāti Raukawa. They joined because their immediate aunties, uncles, cousins and grandparents were in direct conflict with Crown forces. For those Raukawa families, immediate whakapapa would have been the link, immediate kin of today rather than a shared common ancestor of some 800 years previous. Mr. Speaker, like in the Waikato, there were Raukawa families who were related to the Tauranga tribes and were also drawn into the conflict in 1864 and 1867 in the Bay of Plenty. By the time Grey had Waikato and the Kingitanga suppliant, there were still pockets of Raukawa resistance in parts of Tauranga. In 1865, Raukawa's interests in Waikato Tainui land was extinguished, which seriously affected their ability to sustain and maintain their tino rangatiratanga and their mana motuhake. They lost important leaders in their conflict with the Crown. Some carried the stigma of the term rebel. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Crown of the 1860s may have thought they were rebels then, but today the Crown thinks of them as victims of oppressive colonialist government and will make the necessary apology to Raukawa and also redress. Mr. Speaker, this bill will also address one of the country's most shameful pieces of land legislation. The 20,000 acres lost from the Pauakani block, which eventually turned into the incorporated township of Mangakino, whose beneficiaries are from a completely different tribe of Kahungunu from southern Wairarapa. Could there be a more visible wrong than this travesty of justice? People from Wairarapa having mana over 20,000 acres in the township of Mangakino. Could there be a more poison example of how to alienate rightful owners from their land? But that wasn't the only case of Raukawa being left out of certain land entitlements. They were negotiated, that were negotiated in the 1860s. They were left out of the Taupo Nui Aotea block. And this also is a great mamae within the many hapu of Ngāti Raukawa. The omission at Taupo caused much suffering to those hapu of Raukawa. The instances of the Pauakani and Taupo Nui Aotea land blocks are a glaring example of government oppression and ignorance. And being from the south, a very similar situation occurred there as landless natives were in the south were given lands at the folks from the top of the south were given lands right at the bottom of Stewart Island as to compensate them for their landlessness. So these stories are very prevalent right across the country, and it's great that we can bring them to light through the enactment of this legislation. So with the enactment of this settlement bill, the whānau and hapu of Ngāti Raukawa will be able to start their road back to economic wealth and sustainability. And I'm looking forward to joining with my colleagues on the Select Committee as we awhi the progress of the bill through this House, and in particular hearing submissions up in Ngāti Raukawa territory. So I'd just like to conclude my contribution there, and I mihi to Ngāti Raukawa who have travelled down here today. And sir, I commend this bill to the House. Kia ora tātou.
Denise Roche.
Tēnā koe, Mr. Speaker.